Hendriyetti, who is the Senior Capacity Building and Training Economist at ADBI. ADBI is also one of the sponsors of our event. So thank you so much, Nella, for doing this. I will leave it to you to moderate and introduce our speakers. A very warm welcome to all the speakers and the audience. Over to you, Nella.
Thank you, Rajat. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for everyone in many parts of the world. I appreciate your effort to be available for this conference. I hope you all in good health and safe. So thank you very much for ICRIER for asking me to speak and chairing this session. It is my privilege to actually see myself to come back to talk about G20. Before I work in ADBI, I work as a government and part of this G20 meeting. And I can see how this group of 20 countries work together in responding real threat to the global economy. And also more important, how to promote prosperity, and then we can get better quality of life for global population. So welcome to session 4, Sustainable Development Contribution of the G20 to 2030 Agenda. So as Rajat introduced me, my name is Nella Hendriyetti, and I'm a senior economist at ADBI. So I will be serving, I will be your chair in this session today. So as you listen and involved in the discussion since Monday in the ICRIER conference about protection human life and restoring economic stability, we are now that the world now is struggling and the turbulence now is not only about economic stability like how G20 coordinate before, but also how to save people's lives. So I remember when I was in the G20 meeting in 2018, and there's a question that why the G20 focus is too broad. There is a suggestion that G20 should focus on only on the economic agenda and leave the development agenda to other forums or international organizations. However, now we can see that including SDGs in the G20 agenda is beneficial. Countries' government led by the group of G20 countries and together with think tanks will formulate evidence and research-based policies to find solutions to our current situation. So I count that there are around 20 priorities in G20 that related to SDGs. Those can be grouped into economic, social, and environmental dimension. And some of them can be included in cross-cutting categories such as gender, anti-corruption, and technology. So we have our prominent speaker today. First, I will introduce Professor Nicholas Stern. He is IG Patel Professor of Economics and Government at London School of Economics. He is chairman of Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment and head of Indian Observatory. So he will talk about 15 minutes, and then directly after that we go to question and answer for 15 minutes. So please type your question in Q&A or give us a sign that you will ask question later on in the Q&A. So without further ado, I think I give the floor to Professor Stern. Please.
Thank you very much, Nella, and thank you very much to Rajat and ICRIER for putting all this together. And it's wonderful to see my friends from India and my friends from elsewhere on the screen now. I want to try to set the scene, if you like, cover the waterfront and speak about the nature and scale of the challenges of sustainable development and the way in which the G20 and indeed the G7 can help with taking those forward. I think to start by reminding ourselves what we mean by sustainable development, because it's a term that is used often loosely, there is a clear meaning. It means offering to the next generation opportunities at least as good as the ones we had ourselves, assuming they behave in a similar way to generations that follow. That takes us straight away to the question of what determines the opportunities that they have. And we can think in terms of their assets, their human capital, health and education, the physical capital, in terms of capital and infrastructure, physical kind, the natural capital, our land and our forests and our oceans, our water, our air, and social capital, which is the strength of our institutions, the mutual trust, social cohesion, and inequality. Those are the key assets Now, we can look at those assets in more detail. Of course, we have to, because we want to invest in them. But those are the assets that shape whether or not our future is sustainable. And lastly, what we've come to understand is that the drive to sustainable development is also a drive to raising living standards, well-being, of course, towards the SDGs in all their dimensions. So I think that's extremely important, that last point, that the drive to sustainable development is not actually necessarily some kind of difficult compromise between the environment and growth. It's actually a route to increasing living standards, fighting poverty, and the SDGs, of course, are important markers along that way. And that we have those things are wrapped up in each other. It's not as it were, here's the economy on this side, and here's sustainability on that side. Let's focus on the economy and leave sustainability somewhere else. That's a serious analytical, conceptual, practical mistake. They're bound up together, and the pursuit of sustainable development is the pursuit of development and the SDGs. So those are the basic ideas, and it's very important to be clear about those and not let sustainability be carved off somewhere else, and to have that broad notion of investment. Second issue I wanted to raise is, what are the level of commitments around the world? Well, of course, it varies, but the Global Agenda of Paris, December 2015, the SDGs, September to the Sustainable Development Goals in the UN in September 2015 are enormously important. And they've been actually pretty robust through difficult times. If we look at the big areas of the world, simply in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, 50% of them come from EU, China, and United States. And of course, the G20 countries, more like 80% or so of the emissions. So we have to look at the big stories, and the European Union commitment to net zero by 2050 is clear and strong. China has just committed to carbon neutrality by 2060. I am not going to predict the outcome of the United States elections, but let me put it simply, we live in hope. And but we also remember the heterogeneity of the United States, with many cities and states and firms committed strongly to sustainable development. In the last 2 years, the commitment of the private sector has been quite extraordinary. In India, you have clear targets for some of the very biggest firms. Reliance Industries have committed to net zero by 2040. Mahindra, some time ago, the Mahindra Group, a similar commitment. The Tatas committed to sustainability for a long time. Dalmia Cement company, with that strong commitment as well, and Mahendra Singh, as many of you on the call will know. But of course, beyond India, looking at Google and Microsoft and Amazon in the data areas, looking at companies like Siemens in infrastructure, looking at retail like Unilever and Walmart. Across the board, you see these very big commitments, and also great importance in the finance houses as well. Companies like Alliance, a year ago, United Nations, saying that they would have net zero portfolios by 2050 with milestones along the way. Last year, well, not last year, last January in WEF, you had Larry Fink and BlackRock describing how those firms which were moving strongly in that direction had the better financial performance. So you're seeing strong moves in the private sector, in many ways getting ahead of government. And as John Kerry remarked the other day, if the big investors, the big private sectors get out in front, governments, including the G20, will follow. I could go on about community commitment as well, but those of us who work in universities see that the young people are demanding action across the board. They look at the commitments of the companies in which they might work. The companies say they feel employee pressure very strongly. So this is a from government to private sector to community, you see a building of momentum. Now, I don't want to get carried away. That momentum is not strong enough, but it is very important to recognize that there is now something which can be accelerated and something which we have to act to accelerate. And with the G20, as it gets together as governments, must think about and recognize what's happening in the private sector, in the financial institutions, and amongst our young people. They should feel those pressures, and they should actually look to the examples that are being set in the private sector about what's possible, and be confident that if they improve their policies, then the response will be still bigger than it is already becoming. Now, so I wanted to say something about that commitment. And I think some of it has come from an increasing realization of the links between climate, biodiversity, and pollution. You know, I've emphasized climate, and I will in the rest of what I have to say, but we've lost in the last 50 years, 2/3 of our wildlife. In 50 years, 2/3 of our wildlife, that's in terms of vertebrates on land and ocean. That's a blink of the eye in terms of human history. It's devastating, and we depend enormously on our biodiversity. Air pollution is responsible or associated with probably at least 10%, perhaps more, of the deaths each year in the world. It is a deeply serious phenomenon. We've seen the way in which pandemics arise. They're largely zoonotic. They come from wild animals, and that is accelerated, enhanced by the disruption of the relationship between and among wild animals, domestic animals, and human animals. So we've seen just how dependent we are on our natural environment, whether it be climate, biodiversity, pollution, or pandemics. And I think that's played a role in the increasing commitment. Now, very quickly on COVID, the severity of COVID is intense. It is the biggest peacetime shock to output and employment that we have seen over, certainly since the Second World War, arguably longer, particularly severe in developing countries. We must recognize that severity and recognize it's global, recognize developing countries hit particularly hard, and act quickly. We saw in the 1930s how dangerous extended unemployment can be to politics and to societies. That's the first thing. We must act quickly. Second is we must build back in a much better way. I've already emphasized the dangers, and we see the dangers of what went before, and there's a real desire to build back better. And thirdly, we must recognize that so much of what we need to do from the perspective of sustainability, retrofitting buildings, making our cities more friendly to cyclists and pedestrians, forests, restoring degraded land, so much of that can be done quickly, is labor intensive, and has strong economic multipliers. So we should recognize that we need a fast recovery, and a sustainable recovery can contribute strongly to a fast recovery. There's so much more to say about COVID, but let me just add one point and then move on to the story of the drive from recovery to transformatory growth. It's crucial that we don't collapse back into austerity. We made a very serious mistake in the 2008-10 crisis, is after recognizing the importance of expanding demand in the early stages, we as a world slipped back quickly into austerity, and it extended the cost, it extended the unemployment. We have to grow out of this COVID crisis, which means we have to figure out how to get the investment going, how to get the finance for that investment going. So that's very rapid recognition of COVID. But if you compare where we were in December 2019 and where we are now, we knew in December 19 we had to make rapid changes. We knew about the urgency of the challenge. And what we've seen now is that in front of that, we have to come out of the terrible unemployment and health costs of COVID. But we can see that bringing the sustainability principles to that recovery not only is a fast way out of the recovery, it also lays the foundation for the transformation of growth. Amar, I know, will say more about that when he speaks, But let me, in terms of that transformation, recovery to transformation, just emphasize 2 points. First is that we have to have strong innovation and investment to drive that through. And that means putting in place policies which give sufficient confidence for investment to go forward. It means policies which are favorable, helpful to a sustainability story. Getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies, getting a price for carbon, regulating in the right way, setting the right standards, making the strategies clear. India, just a couple of days ago, if I understand it well, said that there would that coal-fired power stations which were retiring would be replaced by renewable energy. Clear strategic statements about that the internal combustion engine will not be sold in vehicles after a particular date, 2030, 2035. All those things give a clear sense of direction, enable investment. And also, of course, we also have to have the right kind of finance in the right place at the right time. And development banks, the existing ones, need to push and expand, and its shareholders have to give it the resources, have to give them the resources to be able to do that. We also need national investment banks. In Roosevelt's New Deal, it's often forgotten that he had a Reconstruction Finance Corporation. The European Union, which is out in front on so much of this, has a European Investment Bank. I'm arguing very strongly in my own country we need a national investment bank. I'm hoping that will come. We will have to see. I think that's true of India as well. But getting the right kind of finance, the right place at the right time, development banks will be important. But so too will be the reorientation of the financial sector in the way I began to describe, and perhaps Amar might be able to develop that. So let me conclude with what the G7 and the G20 can do. Obviously focusing on the G20, that's our topic particularly, but we have to recognize that the way in which those two groupings come together and support each other can be very important. We're fortunate to have next year the G7 led by the UK, the G20 led by Italy, and they're also the co-presidents of COP26 in Glasgow at the end of next year. That means that there's a real possibility for making sustainable recovery and growth the heart of that G7, G20 agenda for next year. I'm trying to do my bit in the UK, speaking directly with the government, the Foreign Office, Treasury, about doing exactly that. But if we had 2 years of that, because Germany at the G7 and India at the G20 presidency in 2022, we could have a coherent international discussion starting now and spreading over at least 2.5 years. The crucial period for the recovery, the crucial period for setting the agenda for sustainable development. So that coordination between those four, agreeing that sustainable recovery and growth is the agenda for the next 2 years, and then getting involved in the detail of what's involved in driving that agenda in terms of policies for investment, in terms of sustainable infrastructure, in terms of the right kind of finance. That is absolutely crucial. But it has to be a big picture strategic story of revitalizing the world's growth. That is a big picture story. It's a big picture challenge. And within that, we have to say, jackets off, let's work on the details of the kind I just described. But setting that big agenda is of fundamental importance. With that, then there's so much that we can do together. Joined up policies, coherent policies, if we are very clear across the world that the internal combustion engine will not be sold from some date in the 2030s, that really puts an accelerator, if you excuse the metaphor, that puts an accelerator on the development of alternative vehicles. If we set clear targets that we will have zero carbon electricity around the world by 2040, again, that gives you a great accelerator to innovation and investment. If the governments and cities of the G20 agree on procurement standards and policies, again, it's all about moving fast and going to scale. And there's so much we can do with G20, G7 if we get together on that. And it is the G7 and the G20 that's the biggest shareholders in the multilateral development banking system, in the development finance institutions. And their role in pushing to scale there will be of enormous importance. Now, there's so much of the detail of policy that matters here, but it's very important to set that in a framework of what we're trying to do and recognition of just how strongly the G20 can bring that forward. I do think that this next 2.5 years with UK, Italy, Germany and India working together, starting now, we could really move to accelerate that process. So let me stop there. I'm sure the other panelists will have plenty to add. I know something of what Amar will say, but I'm looking to the pictures I can see here. Ajay, co-chair of the Energy Transitions Commission, absolutely leading the charge and understanding that area around the world. Rajat from ICRIER, most important think tank in India, across the world, influence. Amar and Dennis and Nella, there's so much coming. So let me just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Stern, and very inspiring. And then I see that you, I mean, like kind of like optimist. I mean, that we can do this. We can reduce the impact of the emission, and we can. So
Nella, I'm very optimistic about what we can do. I worry about what we will do, but it's our job to turn what we can do into what we will do. That's our duty.
Yes, yes. Okay. I see. Now we going to the question and answer. I mean that I will give the floor to ask question. But before that, I think if you don't mind, I will ask question first. As you see that, yeah, you worry about what we can do, and then as you know, in ADBI we talk to government. Actually, now government can like panicking how to do recovery, how to stimulate their growth, so they can like move away their attention a bit from this climate change. So do you think that we still can achieve the target for this climate change? You know, actually, I will like to ask the all the SDG agenda by 2030. So how, I mean, like you said that we need the coherent policies. We need clear zero carbon target and what we should do. So, but with this pandemic, does we need to shift away a little bit? And do you think how far actually we move a little bit? I mean,
I think the sign's wrong, Nella. We don't have to shift away a little bit or a big bit. We enhance and recommit, because that's the way to a strong and sustainable recovery. So I would completely reject the sort of direction of the question, how far should we move away? It's actually the commitment to move strongly on sustainable development is the way to recover quickly and strongly and to lay the foundations for the future. It's quite striking, actually, that in these last few months, how the European Union has recommitted, redoubled, as it were, its commitment to sustainable growth, to reducing emissions, and couples it, actually, with the route out of the COVID economic crisis. China in September, just 3 weeks ago, gave its commitment to zero by 2060. It is remarkable how many of the firms that I described made their commitment to net zero by 2040 during the COVID crisis. Mukesh Ambani's speech to Reliance Industries was in July. It was last month that Google Alphabet gave its commitment to net zero by 2040 and to buying back past emissions. So I do think that people are seeing that this is a moment to redouble efforts, not only because sustainability is so important, but this is a good route out of the COVID crisis. And further, that's what people are looking for. People are asking themselves the question, were we in a good place? Do we simply want to go back to the old structures that were so dangerous? And they're saying that we don't. So I think politically and economically, this is a moment to accelerate. I know that that is an argument that needs to be won, but it's an argument that needs to be taken on directly. And I think it's an argument that deserves to succeed and has some chance of succeeding if we keep going.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Stan. Yeah, that's also like input, like now the world government also see that how the air pollution, lower because of COVID-19. So, and they see that how, this is the timely to improve their awareness about the climate change. Maybe now I can open the floor. Or is there any from panelists to ask question? Yes, Rajat.
No, I don't have a question. I mean, Nick's has been great, and maybe Nick, you can talk a little bit about the inclusive agenda. It's important to restructure policies towards an inclusive agenda.
Yes.
And that's where our old policies have sort of gone wrong, especially in countries like India and even in the United States.
Thank you, Rajat. It is very important, and there are opportunities and challenges. We know that the kind of activities that I described, refitting buildings that are inefficient, restoring degraded land, making our cities more friendly to cyclists and pedestrians, looking after our water systems better. All of those things are very important from the point of view of sustainability, and they're full of opportunity for the recovery. Looking further ahead, we can see that so many of those kinds of activities involve really big employment opportunities. Far more people would be involved in a decentralized solar system, making the panels, taking them out, working on the finance associated with them. Far more job opportunities than you'd find in a conventional heavy fossil fuel grid structure. So those new activities and the recovery story are good for employment and good for inclusion. A lot of aspects of decentralized power, for example, give great advantages on gender as well, because it's often women who will be looking after the solar panel, looking after the renting out, the recharging of mobile phones and so on. And of course, not having to go and fetch firewood. So a lot of the story is of opportunities which are really important for inclusion. But there's another part of the story, which is dislocation. Radical change in our industrial structure means some jobs are lost. That's the point. You're changing structure. You're doing things differently. And a very important part of the policy will be to manage that transition in a fair and decent and inclusive way. That if you stop doing things in damaging and inefficient and wasteful ways, then there's huge scope for improvement. That's the improvement that we look for this generation and for the next. But at the same time, radical change does involve dislocation, and managing that so-called just transition, achieving a just transition is very important. And it will involve investment in people, in their skills. It'll involve investment in some places, because some of the dislocation will be concentrated in particular places. And it may involve helping people to move if those other investments don't fully cover the story. And finally, if all those things don't work, then direct support or social security. But we should see it in a positive way, it seems, managing the dislocation. Start with the idea of investing in people and places.
Okay, thank you, Professor Stern. And then one, if you allow me asking, when I was in G20, and then we even like at the time that the countries can like work together to achieve the goals, but some countries sometimes asking for the compromise for green finance, green development. So, and then 2016, 2017, and then one country like back up from the commitment. So, and then now G20, you know, they need to have a consensus to achieve common goals, right? So, do you think, do you have a suggestion what kind of strategy so we can like compromise every country needs? And then that's first, and the second one is, you know, you're talking about EU that you have a clear, coherent goals to achieve this lower carbon emission. But how about developing countries? You know, like they already have companies with coal. So if they move their factory, they move their machine to the, it need to a power plant to like more renewable. They need like more investment, and this I know that in their NDC they already put that, but because of this COVID-19 they need to like work out. I mean, like try to you know, revise their budget. I mean, which one that allocate to this project and which one that really to recover the budget for recovery of the COVID-19.
Yeah, well, I've tried to argue that separating out sustainability from recovery is a mistake, that actually putting them together, you do better. And we've seen, and Ajay, I'm sure, I hope will say something, just how much the economics has changed on sustainable investment right across the world, including even particularly in India. We see round-the-clock solar as out competing without carbon price and without subsidy, fossil fuel-related electricity. Ajay is a world expert on that. He can come in. But the idea that somehow you can't afford to do it now, you can't afford not to do it now, because in so many places it's cheaper. Even under narrow criteria, and of course it's a lot cheaper and strong investment if you look to the longer term story. So I think to put those investments at center stage and not to slip back into some kind of artificial horse race between sustainability and employment, between sustainability on the one hand and employment growth on the other, that is crucial. And that's what good economics and this ICRIER and Terry and LSE and Brookings and the Dennis Institute, that's what we're here to do, to try to put forward a careful, detailed economic analysis that shows that instinctive sort of horse race is actually misguided and artificial and damaging.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's very interesting. So I think we already like 30 minutes past this for this session. So thank you very much, Professor Stan. And then with that, I think please join me to give appreciation for Professor Stan. And then if you have a more question, maybe just type to the host, and then maybe they can forward it to Professor Stan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nella. And let me add my thank you and appreciation for Nick for coming here. I know you have another engagement, but thank you really for doing this and setting the tone for this session. I think you brilliantly did that. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you very much for having me, and do please excuse me. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Stan. Okay. Next, we continue. We have three panelists, and first we have our speaker, Dr. Ajay Mathur. He is a Director of General of the Energy and Resource Institute and a member of the Prime Minister Council on Climate Change. He's a key negotiator, key Indian climate change negotiator and Indian spokesperson at 2015 climate negotiation in Paris. So I think without further ado, I give the floor to Dr. Mathur. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nella. As you know, Professor Stern is a hard act to follow, and for me particularly because he and I think similarly to what he says. And consequently, I end up repeating what he has said, but I think some of these things bear reinforcement. But I think I'll step one step back and point out that the G20 was originally an informal grouping which looked at finances. And it grew into a meeting which was both broader in agenda, included development, and became a leaders level summit. I think it is important to remember this as we move ahead, because G20 is in a sense structured both in its past and in its present. We have seen that the appointment of Sherpas has helped in both institutionalizing the process as well as making it more broad-based. For India in particular, the 2015 Antalya summit was important, because it was at that summit when India, one, of course, SDGs was adopted. SDGs had been adopted in 2015, and at the Antalya summit, the G20 process said that we will go ahead. It is our goal to push G20, to push SDGs as well. And in his lead intervention during the lunch at the Antalya summit, Prime Minister Modi of India had made the point that, remember this 2015, things have changed since, that he said that we would go to renewables of 175 gigawatts by 2022. Now that's been enhanced for the years beyond, not for 2022. He also said that we would look at the National Clean Energy Fund, the cut in subsidies on fuel, etc., etc. But I would like to emphasize, and I quote what he said. I quote, "At G20, we can play an effective role in supporting the multilateral goals of increasing research and development to develop affordable renewable energy," end quote. I want to emphasize that in this process, energy and particularly renewable energy have been at the heart of India's commitments. I'll come back a little more to it in half a minute. And as part of this, this renewable energy goal, one of the things that was discussed at India's behest was the creation of the International Solar Alliance, which was then President Hollande and Prime Minister Modi launched at the Paris negotiations later in that year. That's, of course, a reality. 67 countries have deposited their instruments of ratification. The Solar Alliance is moving towards enhancing the ability, particularly of developing countries, to move ahead and push for investment in renewables rather than in fossil fuels. Now, as far as SDGs are concerned, I think that it's important that what the G20 process did was for India to bring SDGs into the limelight. But what do I mean by it? It's not as if any of the G20 goals were not already there as far as the government of India was concerned. They were there. But what it did was to bring attention and priority to them. And a whole process has started. How are we doing on the SDGs? And, at this point of time, I would like to stress that for a country like India, which is a large country, the reality in different parts of the country is different. The needs are different, the circumstances are different. We are a federal polity where our constitution says that some things have to be done at the level of municipalities, others at the level of state governments, others at the level of the federal government. So this structure and the fact that there is a huge amount of diversity across the country also has an impact on the SDGs and their implementation. And a study was carried out in 2017, 2018, which was in 2019, it was presented, which brought out these challenges. And therefore, there was a huge devolvement of actual measures that occurred over on how they would occur. What is it that state governments would do? What is it that, so they got a lot more leeway in how they would do things and what is it that they would push based on their local realities. I think this was a very important issue, this issue of devolvement. And more recently, we have had the 15th Finance Commission. The Finance Commission in India is something that takes the entire pool of taxes that are collected at the federal level and reallocates them to the states. So the Finance Commission has also helped in this devolution by providing more resources to the states and particularly to the municipal bodies. The second thing that occurred as a result of this 2019 evaluation was the establishment of a dashboard and a continuous process of assessment on how we are doing on the SDGs. This has been very useful because amongst other things, what it pointed out was that there are 5 goals where we have had a positive push.
Rajat, I think that's
Peace, justice, and strong institutions. These have pushed. In all of these, India scored between 65 and 99. There were 2 goals in which we were not doing well, less than 50, which were number 2, hunger, and number 5, gender equality. So these demand special attention. And there were 8 goals where the other 8 goals where we saw that we needed, there was a scope for significant improvement in the coming year. So what it did was it, at a granular level, provided where is it that attention needs to be done, what needs to be done at the federal level, what needs to be done at the state level and the more decentralized level. We presented a voluntary national review in the virtual UN General Assembly that was held recently and pointed out what is it that we have done and where is it that we are. But I think the most important issue of the voluntary national review was India's attempts to ensure the global to local approach by giving more powers to states and district level implementation of the SDGs, which is at the core of how we implement. As we look to the future, and this is something that Professor Stern had pointed out, as we look to the future, there are many opportunities. One, of course, is that India assumes the presidency of the G20 in 2022. We feel this is important. Now, as Professor Stern mentioned, I come from an energy background. I think that's the begin all, end all of everything. So pardon me for my energy emphasis, but I do believe that the socialization of the International Solar Alliance amongst the G20 should be one of our goals, as should be the resource efficiency emphasis that the government of India has created. I think it makes sense in all countries where development is still happening, because resource efficiency brings here and now benefits apart from the longer term climate benefits as well. I also believe that having launched the CDRI, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, this is again something that affects all countries, whether developing or developed. This is again something which I think can be taken up at the G20 level. Waste management, specifically plastic waste, is again something which India has started on. I wouldn't say that that much has been achieved, but at least the institutional structures are now in the process of being formed. That's something else on which I believe a global coalition and a global initiative can be launched. I would like to end, Nella, by pointing out that India has come a long way, yet there is still a very long way to go, and there are only 10 more years. So I think what the G22 presidency provides an opportunity for is to piggyback onto the national process, the kinds of international agenda that India can and should push during the 2022 and in the years that follow. I will finally say that, you know, this is like one of those classic things, is the glass half full or half empty? I would suggest that it is both. And I think it is in that light that we need to look at the future of SDGs and of the role of G20 in achieving those SDGs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mathur. Very, very impressive. And then actually for myself, I look up to India. I mean, as a member of G20, I mean, India is developing countries and very democratic countries, and you have a direct election. And then, you know, if you push something's not popular for the people, that will be difficult sometimes, somehow. But you achieve like very tremendous target. I mean, like, you like financial inclusion, and now you have a target for climate change, and then you also like try to I know that you have because I work with Indian think tank about the urban sanitation and solid waste management, so you work in many aspects in the SDGs. Actually, I think this is can be, I mean, for the input for developing country especially. How, I mean, if like, you know, how the country need to shift to renewable energy, I mean, like to reduce the pollution. And then is there any challenge, I mean, yeah, to achieve, to commit to the international target? Maybe I know that's difficult, but that's maybe a clear way over there. But to convince the national, the people in your country, I mean, to achieve that, what the strategy that India actually doing, Dr. Mathur?
So I think one of the points that I would like to stress, that India's approach has been and continues to be to push for those kinds of actions which lead to here and now development benefits. Let me give you an example. In the electricity sector, the amount of electricity used by Indians is abysmally small. There's no country in the world which has become a developed country with a high quality of life, say the OECD countries, without using at least 4 tons of oil used, not supplied, 4 tons of oil equivalent per person per year. No country, zero. Where is India? Our consumption is 0.6 tons of oil equivalent worth of energy per person per year. It's a huge way to go. Now, the interesting thing is that this provides opportunities as well, because if all of this going from 0.6 to 4 is based on carbon, then we have fried the world. So the challenge is, does this provide us with a roadmap to move towards zero carbon emissions as we move ahead? And the answer, Nella, is yes. As Professor Stern mentioned, we now have come up through a public tendering process with prices for round-the-clock renewable energy which are competitive with those from coal energy. That's happened now, to be delivered in 2 years. So 2 years from now, we may be seeing a picture in which round-the-clock renewable energy may be the same cost or cheaper than coal-based electricity. In the future, therefore, all new electricity generation, and remember, we are going from 0.6 to 2, so there'll be a lot of new electricity generation that will occur that would be based on renewables plus storage, not on fossil fuels. This is a huge change. And I think we are at the cusp of it. And the kinds of learnings that occur here can occur in other countries. Now, this is not to say that there isn't a backlash. There is a backlash, as you very rightly said. There's backlash because of established vested interests. There is a backlash because of the lack of a skilled manpower. There's a backlash because of the limited supply chain. But all of those are things that all countries, all developing countries and developed countries have faced in the past. We ourselves faced it in the Green Revolution. We overcame it. And there is no reason why we can't do this with the renewables revolution as well.
Thank you, Dr. Mathur. Is there, my question, you said that how you try to solve the problem nationally. Can I, especially for renewable energy, is there any kind of like incentive the government give to the investor? I mean, because you said that you have a target that maybe in the future renewable energy may be cheaper than coal. So, I mean, if you can give us a concrete examples.
So India has not provided a direct incentive for renewable energy. But in coming here, there have been a set of steps. For example, and again, that had nothing to do with climate change, but more with energy security. Starting in the late 1990s, various states in the country started experimenting with what they call as renewable portfolio obligations. That means that the distribution companies had to buy a certain amount of renewable energy as a part of their mix, and the costs would be market determined costs and socialized across all electricity users. So there was no incentive. Yes, there are some incentives. For example, when you move renewable electricity from one state to another, there is in our tariff system something called an interstate surcharge. That does not apply to renewables, but it does apply to fossil fuel based electricity. So that's one. There are other things that are there as well. But overall, they do not influence the larger picture of the reduction in costs of renewable electricity on a round-the-clock basis. So I think what I'd like to emphasize is these are market-driven changes. Because the problem with incentives and subsidies is that they will work for some time, but no country has enough money to keep subsidizing forever. We are all very grateful, particularly to Germany, which through the initial subsidization of renewable energy, particularly solar, enabled the cost curve to come down. And even in Germany, there are limits to how much subsidy they can provide. So I would not like developing countries which are already cash strapped to move on an incentive route, but move as close to commercial as possible.
Thank
and
you.
This is true for most of development infrastructure.
That's good. I mean, like I can give the input later for policy brief on in ADBI, because we usually like provide this incentive, make the renewable energy cheaper. But that's, your suggestion is good. It's market-driven change. So the change got to be like from market, right? So it's not like from the government to push that. So that's very, very good idea. I mean, like I will take notes for that. Is there, I mean, like Rajat, do you want to, I mean, add something? Yeah.
No, Nella. I think we should move on to the next speaker. Thank you so much, Ajay.
Okay.
Thank
so
you.
If there's no question, and then thank you very much, Dr. Mathur, and a very clear description about how India doing in these SDGs. Thank you very much. Please join me to give appreciation to Dr. Mathur. Thank you. And then next, our panelist will be Professor Bhattacharya. He is a senior fellow at Global Economy and Development Program in Brookings Institution. He also co-lead of the Sustainable Growth and Finance Initiative, or the New Climate Economy, under Global Commission on the Economy and Climate. And he has been active participant in the global economic discussion and a key representative of the views of developing countries, and had leading role in G24 and the G20 discussion. I think without further ado, I give the floor to Professor Bhattacharya.
Thank you very much, Nella, and thank you, Rajat. It's a pleasure to join once again the G20 conference that ICRIER puts together. I believe it really helps not just bring the voice of India to the table, but the partnership with ADBI and others has really it has proven to be a very powerful forum in terms of bringing the voice of emerging markets and developing countries to the table. I will, as you can already see, use a PowerPoint presentation, and I will go systematically but efficiently through it, and then save some time, of course, for interaction. And as Professor Stern said, I mean, I intend to complement very much what he elaborated, and also what we heard from Ajay Mathur right now, by focusing on the centrality of quality and sustainable infrastructure, and the role of the G20 in pushing that agenda. So I will follow, as you can see in slide 2, a 4-part structure. I'll talk about the urgency, scale, and opportunity that's offered at this point in time, and particularly as we look at the, as Professor Stern said, in the post-COVID context. Within that, I want to talk about the central role of sustainable infrastructure. Third, I'll talk about G20 leadership on quality infrastructure and climate action, building very much on work that I was privileged to engage with Nella and the ADBI in 2019. And last, I will end with the challenge of accelerating change. So in slide 3, the point here is that the next 2 decades are really a moment in history. This is the time when we will see a doubling in the capital stock of the world, and particularly on infrastructure, which determines the pattern of growth and development. And part of the reason for this is tremendous structural change and the convergence of emerging markets and developing countries. It's also a time when overall growth, therefore, will increase, and it's a time of extraordinary structural change, not least because of urbanization. Urban areas will double in the next 20 years, notwithstanding COVID, and urban population in the next 40 years. All of this must be accomplished, as Professor Stern pointed out, by reducing emissions very significantly. If we wanted to get to to 1.5 degrees, we must get to net zero by 2050. If we have to live with 2 degrees, then gives us maybe another 20 years. But that still requires a front loading of the cut on emissions. If you look at slide 4, and this is very, very evident right now, that the science of climate change is really upon us in a very big way, not just in terms of what we are seeing in terms of evident climate change, but also what we are witnessing in terms of tipping points. We are at the risk of major irreversible change that will affect the planet and the people who live on it in a very detrimental way. And the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees is very significant in terms of heat, in terms of precipitation, and in terms of droughts and the impact it will have across geographies. So acting on climate and acting quickly is absolutely essential, as Professor Stern pointed out. And if you look at slide 5, you will see that the current path is far from sustainable. If we stay on the path that we are on, then temperatures will increase in the range of 3 degrees plus. And to limit it to 1.5 degrees, as I said, we have to get to net zero by 2050. But the current trajectory, even as improved by the Paris climate agreements, will not suffice. And as Professor Stern pointed out, and as you see in slide 6, and this is also what Dr. Mathur pointed out, this is not a cost. It's actually an opportunity to put the world on a much better growth path. You can get from this better growth path, which is linked to innovation, which is linked to investment, a higher bang for the buck in 5 to 10 years. You can not only get investment, you can get productivity, but it's also very important to think about the endogeneity of this change in terms of innovation. This can be the new innovation that can drive, in some sense, the transformation that Professor Stern pointed out. And we have to remember that if we stay on the present path, it will implode. There is no alternative but a sustainable growth path. This is the growth future that we have, and we have to seize it. Let me now turn to the next aspect, which is the central role of sustainable infrastructure. So sustainable infrastructure is really key to growth, to development, and to climate. As Rajat was pointing out, sustainable infrastructure is actually a segue to inclusion. And it does that through two ways. It supports inclusive growth, but it also enhances the access of people and places to basic services. It is a very, very powerful determinant, therefore, of delivery of the SDG goals related to poverty, to education, to health, to betterment, to empowerment. So it's really an important driver. And investing in sustainable infrastructure is investing in the future, investing in those SDGs. But it is also a way to ensure environmental sustainability. And for the first time, the SDGs recognized the importance of the global commons, not just poverty and basic services, but the global commons as a foundation on which sustainability of the planet rests. So environmental sustainability also depends very crucially on sustainable infrastructure. And with respect to emissions in particular, 60 to 70% of emissions of the world are determined by the build and pattern of sustainable infrastructure. If you look at slide 9, we know that there are 4 major systems of infrastructure that have to be built and the associated services that go with it: energy, transport, water and sanitation, and the digital infrastructure. If you look at the example of India, we know that all of these are challenges. It is quite striking that as part of the recovery plan that India is pushing under Prime Minister Modi, there is a plan to invest $1.5 trillion in these infrastructure sectors. And this is the way for transformation for a country like India. There are challenges, I will come to that, but having these kinds of investments will be critical if we are to be able to attain the 2030 development agenda. If you look at slide 10, it tells you the key systems a little bit more in detail around which transformation has to happen. Energy, as Dr. Mathur pointed out, is really at the core of it because it's the way in which we get to the low carbon transition. So energy, both on the demand side as well as on the supply side, are tremendous, and it weaves its way through the other areas that I will talk about. Cities. India will be the country that will see the most rapid urbanization in the next 20 years. And all of this is not going to happen in the mega cities. Increasingly, this is going to happen in second-tier cities, and meeting that challenge will be, let's put it, challenging. Food and land use, again, agriculture and land use accounts for 30% of global emissions. India is tremendously important in that area for 2 reasons. A very large proportion of people live in, associated with agriculture and land. And second, a lot of the economic activity is still agriculture based. Water is going to be a tremendous challenge for India in the face of climate change. Too much water and too little water, and the provision of clean water. Adequate investments in water and sanitation, as the Prime Minister has noted, will be of tremendous importance. And finally, an area where Dr. Mathur has been leading, industry, innovation, and transport, all on the demand side. One thing that I did not hear Dr. Mathur mention, but he has been a pioneer on, is the prospect for major changes in cooling technology as a way not just to reduce carbon emissions, but GHG emissions. And India, what happens in India in the cooling sector will make a huge determination in terms of outcomes. So a report that I was associated with, the 2018 New Climate Economy report, did modeling exercises on what transformative changes in these areas would mean, and it amounts to a lot of jobs, 65 million additional jobs, a lot of potential available finance if you address the policy deficiencies, especially the lack of carbon pricing, and the health benefits, as you are seeing in the post-COVID world, are tremendous in terms of reduced congestion and reduced pollution. Now, in the COVID context, what we also find, and you see this in slide 11, is that sustainable investments have very, very good short and long run features. In the short run, clean energy infrastructure like insulation retrofits, building wind turbines, restoring wetlands, in the Indian context, restoring soils, is labor intensive, but not import intensive or susceptible to offshoring. Consequently, they can be done speedily, they have good multipliers, and they can produce jobs. These are very, very important values. And if you look at the right side, this is a work survey, done by Cameron Hepburn, Joe Stiglitz, Nick Stern, and it tells you that actually the policymakers think that these multipliers actually are indeed that powerful. In the long run, focus on operations and maintenance of renewable technologies will become very important. Productivity rises from energy cost savings can produce, and as I had pointed out, the power of innovation. So sustainable investments have appealing short and long run characteristics, especially as we come out of the recession. If you go to slide 12 and you look at how we are doing so far in terms of the initial spending and stimulus packages, the answer is not so good. The exception has been Europe, and I will spend 1 minute on that, but the rest of the world, and it's including China and including India, have not focused as much on green as they could profitably for their own growth. So I think there is still a lot of challenge, but we have to remember that most of the recovery packages are still ahead of us, not yet spent. So we still have the opportunity to get it right. With Europe, I want to say something that I think is extremely powerful. One is that Europe has been grappling with the European Green Deal before COVID. In COP25 in Madrid, they announced the European Green Deal, and essentially it's a vision and a roadmap for Europe to achieve net zero. But the important thing about that Green Deal was that it was a strategic investment opportunity that drove it in both the climate space as well as the digital space. When COVID came along, therefore, Europe was very well positioned, therefore, to think about a recovery plan that could become a transformation plan, as Professor Stern pointed out. They had a detailed roadmap. They put in the recovery mechanisms. And the next item I want to emphasize with Europe, and this is extremely important to answer the point that Nella was mentioning, and that is the importance of finance. And what the Europeans did is they put in a financing mechanism, they put in recovery funds for the short run, and they charged the European Investment Bank to mobilize 1 trillion of financing over the next 8 to 9 years in partnership with the private sector. So I often say that if the rest of the world does what Europe does, then we will all reach nirvana. But the challenge for the rest of the world is they don't have the deep pockets of Europe in terms of the European financial institutions and the European Investment Bank, and I'll come to that. Now, when you think about this challenge, we must remember, and this is something that is so evident in India, that sustainable infrastructure is a complicated and difficult business. We make decisions on infrastructure based on political cycles that are short term, but these decisions matter for generations, indeed millennia to come. The decision-making, the governance structure of infrastructure is complicated because of long-term and large upfront investments, because of spillovers and externalities, and the complex decision-making. At the same time, we have this urgency, as I mentioned, to cut carbon emissions. So for countries like India, coming up with a robust upstream policy and institutional framework that can unlock solid pipelines of projects, scale them up, ensure that each project is done to high standard, and mobilizing and aligning finance with this purpose is not an easy task. But as Dr. Mathur said, we can do it. We know how to do it. The challenge will be the political economy. The challenge will be the institutional structures. The challenge will be international cooperation. Let me move to the role of the G20 very, very quickly. If you look at slide 15, you will see that infrastructure and climate has been a central part of the G20 agenda since it was constituted at leaders level in 2009. It had featured even before that in the finance ministers level, but since 2009, infrastructure and climate has been center stage in the G20 agenda. I won't go through all the detail. I just want to highlight that in the German presidency, there was very good progress through the Hamburg Action Plan that on climate. That was extremely important. Preceding that, China had put a lot of emphasis on infrastructure, and before that, Australia. In Argentina's year, which was 2018, and very centrally in the Japanese year, there was the development of two initiatives that are quite important and relevant even today. A roadmap to develop infrastructure as an asset class, so to help mobilize the trillions of dollars that are needed. And the second one is the principles of quality infrastructure, which I will come to. If you look at slide 17, you will see that in Argentina, there was this roadmap of infrastructure as an asset class, with two main building blocks, improving project development and improving investment environment. And in the Japanese year, Japan pushed very hard, and there was a lot of let's say lively debate and discussion, but there was an agreement on the principles of quality infrastructure, which is both the important development role that infrastructure played, very much emphasized by countries like China and India, but also the importance of getting things right, which are enumerated in those principles. In the same year, I was privileged to work with Nella and with my esteemed colleague and friend, Dr. Yoshino, then president of the ADBI, who led our task force on the economic effects of infrastructure investment and its finance. And that really put emphasis on three pillars: how to maximize the impact of quality infrastructure investment. It's not that you just invest in infrastructure, you have to keep an eye that you are in some sense ensuring that both the direct as well as the spillover effects are maximized. And I remember Dr. Yoshino speaking in the same forum in 2019, arguing and making the case of how important the spillovers had been when infrastructure investment was done right. The second is by boosting or integrate in quality infrastructure by integrating impactful environmental solutions into the decision making and into the design of infrastructure. And finally, and this has become so evident in the COVID world, developing strategies for enhancing resilient and infrastructure development. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the tremendous role that Nella Hendriyetti played in bringing us together and making a very meaningful set of policy briefs in the year that Japan led the G20 presidency, and that has helped tremendously in taking this agenda forward under the Saudi presidency. I want to make two other points about the role of the G20. The first is, as both Professor Stern and Dr. Mathur pointed out, the importance of getting the pricing right, and particularly the importance of eliminating fossil fuel subsidies and putting in place credible carbon pricing. These are both objectives that the G20 has signed on in principle, but the progress to date has not been so good. Taking advantage of the exceptionally low fossil fuel prices at this point, and also the need to mobilize resources, I hope that the G20 can become more ambitious with regard to this policy framework. The next item that I want to emphasize is very much that we are going to face an extraordinary period with regard to financing. Nowhere is this more evident than in India, where there are tremendous needs and tremendous challenges because of the pressure on government balance sheets, because of the pressure on bank balance sheets, and because of the difficulties now in international financial markets. So mobilizing the required capital for sustainable investment and infrastructure will require unlocking all pools and enhancing and ensuring that they can all work together. And in this regard, as Professor Stern pointed out, the role of development finance institutions will be absolutely critical. And coming from India, if I could make the point that unlike, say, China or Brazil, or what Professor Stern is talking about in the UK or Europe, India is missing right now scale institutions on development finance. And I believe that this is something that needs to be thought about as part of the solution in the post-COVID world. But it's not just enough to mobilize finance. It's also important that the finance that is mobilized is aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and with climate. I won't spend time on it, but there are three main pillars: disclosure and reporting, regulatory frameworks, and moving to green finance. Let me end here and just with the last slide, which is slide 24. Can this be done? I think we are at a unique opportunity with regard to four forces at this point in time. The first is there has never been a time when we have more abundant pool of savings for the world, and there has never been a time when interest rates have been so low. We can put that power of money for development at this point in time, as I was suggesting. Second, as Professor Stern and Dr. Mathur pointed out, we have rapid technological change and falling costs, not just in renewables, but in materials, in digital, and so many areas. Third, there are powerful international agreements that can give purpose and drive. And last but not least, young people today are mobilized in a way that can help give momentum and can hold everyone, including the G20, to account. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Bhattacharya. Very impressive. And then, we ever worked together in G20 last year about this topic. So I kind of enjoy your presentation. So is there any question from the floor? Because if you give that to me, this I will have a lot of questions, but this will be me on the time. So if you just raise your hand and then just I will give you the floor. But I will, actually ADBI until now we still put this quality infrastructure investment like as our priority. So every time we talk about infrastructure, we talk about spillover effect. And then Dean Sonobe, Tatsushi Sonobe now, our Dean, he also emphasized this in his presentation. But he added like one component on that, that's human capital. So and then when I did the project in ADBI, we found out actually, like India, Indonesia, South Africa, developing country in G20, actually they have a capability. So the problem more now on how to create the project to be bankable, to create this framework in the country. But we found out actually for the low income countries, even they don't know how to create infrastructure that can stimulate the economy, can save to the environment. So they can don't have the capacity to build that infrastructure that fulfill the requirement in the quality infrastructure principle. So that's we found that, and now I think Dean Sonobe the human capital, the training, the to improve the skill in for the quality infrastructure investment in developing countries like low income countries, maybe this also crucial. So that's my addition for this. And then I would like to ask question for you that we have in Japanese that presidency that we have a quality infrastructure investment, and now during Saudi Arabia G20 and then discussion in the side of the G20 Saudi Arabia, I found some people using that sustainable. So they add like sustainable infrastructure investment. So is there any tendency, is there any input from countries? Actually, there's a demand that to change the quality infrastructure to be like quality sustainable infrastructure investment. So, is there will be recommendation for the future infrastructure recommendation? That's, Professor Bhattacharya, if you.
So these two terms, sustainable and quality infrastructure, have been used. So I just want to give a little bit of history. So sustainable infrastructure, as a term really became popular, after around 1987. The World Bank started using it, and embodied in that was very much this idea that, you have to look at the long run and impacts. The way I have defined personally in my work, sustainable infrastructure, is there are two characteristics about infrastructure that really define it, quintessentially. The first is the benefits and, the costs are paid up front, but the benefits really are reaped by generations. It's a long term in a way that, we have to think about Rome building roads in Europe and, paying back over 2,000 years. The second part of infrastructure that's, unique is what we think about our externalities or spillovers. When you, as Dr. Yoshino has pointed out so aptly, when a car drives on a road, it taps maybe 10-15% of the benefit of the road. Most of that benefit goes to the contiguous areas. It's that externality that defines infrastructure. And that, by the way, applies to negative externalities. If the world today is being dissected by linear infrastructure. The population of the world has gone, has doubled, in the last, 50 years. And, we are building more and more linear infrastructure. So in a way, infrastructure has tremendous impacts on ecosystems and on climate. So this characteristic of infrastructure really is why we have focused on sustainability. The reason that Japan focused on quality is recognizing that, you have to think also about the sustainability of economics and finance, including the debt sustainability. You have to think about operations and maintenance. But I have done a very careful mapping of quality infrastructure with sustainable infrastructure. And the way I would put it is, you cannot have quality infrastructure without being sustainable, and sustainable infrastructure embodies all of the principles of quality infrastructure.
Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya. And we have a question from the floor. Climate finance is very crucial. However, developing economies are also faced with other important policy priorities. Then how does one proceed in this direction in mobilizing resources? I think now that's the problem, especially for developing countries. And, you know, Professor Bhattacharya, we did like run out of time. So if you can answer that in 1 minute, thank you.
Okay. So I think the best way to think about it is the way that Dr. Mathur put it, that increasingly climate finance is development finance, because what you are financing is not just good for climate, it's good for development. If you make irrigation waterproof, climate proof, it's good development, it's good climate. If you replace coal-fired power plants by renewables, it's good climate, but it's also good development. If you pursue building efficiency, it's good climate, it's good development. If you pursue urban renewal and good land use, it's development, but it's also climate. The challenge is not climate finance. The challenge is mobilizing finance that can drive both climate as well as development.
Okay, thank you very much. I think please join me to give appreciation to Dr. Bhattacharya. Thank you very much. Very broad, very inspiring input for infrastructure investment. So now we go to, we have our panelist, Dr. Dennis Görlich. He is a research director in Global Solution Initiative. And I collaborate with him when he managed the Global Solution Summit on 2019. So he has a PhD in economics from University of Kiel, Germany, and master in economics from Maastricht University, Netherlands. His expertise is on impact of digitalization on the division of labor between and within countries, and organization and governance, sustainable global supply chains. So I think without further ado, I give the floor to Dr. Görlich, please.
Thank you, Nella. And I try to be very brief in my points that I would like to make in the interest of time. I hope that's appreciated. So I think what we've seen clearly in the current COVID pandemic is that it has really put a spotlight on how interdependent the world has become. And also, I think importantly, how fragile many of the achievements are that we have made. Inequalities are increasing again and stronger than before. Trust between countries was eroded quite rapidly. International cooperation was questioned by many countries amid the crisis. And of course, we know that multilateralism has been under fire before too, nationalism emerging in many countries, trade conflicts, and well, people that really no longer believed in the globalization we, and importantly also the G20, have promoted for many years, and probably rightly so, they were unsatisfied with it. Governance architecture did not really work that well anymore. It's not that fit for interdependent economies. New emerging powers on the economic front are emerging. And then also, I think an important field is that we have a new digital world that is largely ungoverned, and where there's really currently no global consensus on how we actually govern it. So we need to shape a world that is really prepared for that, for the digital, for the technology that is coming ahead, digital trade, data transfers, skepticism towards hyperglobalization, and also that's prepared for the emergencies like pandemics and importantly also climate change. Now, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are in fact a set of 17 positive goals that are universally agreed, which can, and that has been said before, that should give direction in how we shape this world. And it can also, for the G20, I think importantly add legitimization to it and acceptability, because after all, it's an international forum that is not, it doesn't have a mandate as such, but needs to be legitimized through its actions and showing that it can contribute to positive change in the world. So, but nevertheless, I think the G20 is a crucial forum, and this is why the incoming Italian presidency and also the Indian presidency in 2022 will have, I think, a very decisive role to play in shaping that world. Can they reinvigorate support for multilateralism? I hope so. And they need to take this task probably very seriously in building a global partnership and articulate very strongly in that the principles and also the benefits of multilateral action in order to achieve support also domestically. And as I've said, and others have said before, the catalog of SDGs can be used as an overarching benchmark, in fact, for national action and also for collective action at the SDG level. Now, in a policy brief that we have written for T20 Saudi Arabia, together with Homi Karas and Sebastian Strauss from Brookings, we have indeed identified several areas where the world is currently failing to make adequate progress towards achieving the SDGs. And I'd like to stress just two of these points that we've identified. And one is that reporting is not systematic, measurement is not always good, and accountability is weak. And the second point where world is failing to make progress is that global commons are really, despite some global agreements, not adequately protected at the time. Now, amid the COVID crisis, all countries in the world have brought together support packages for the economies. And as we argue in the policy brief, these SDGs should really provide some kind of North Star for the design of these support packages. And in that regard, a common reporting of progress towards SDGs would, of course, be very helpful. We suggest, for example, that the G20 should incorporate progress measures into their G20 mutual assessment process, using mutually agreed country goals, such as the SDGs, wherever it's appropriate, and report not on them separately in some working group, but to include it in the major mutual assessment process of the G20. And clearly, we cannot really achieve satisfactory progress if we rely on GDP as a measure of prosperity only, but it also needs to take into account the social and the environmental dimension, because after all, this is really what matters to humans beyond just material gain. The Global Solutions Initiative, in particular Dennis Snower and my colleague Katarina Miranda from the Kiel Institute, they have developed what they call a recoupling dashboard that tries to track material prosperity alongside social prosperity and also environmental sustainability. Now, GDP and environmental performance, the EPI, the Environmental Performance Index, are in fact very established measurements of progress and prosperity, while a measure of social prosperity as such is new. And this measure, this dashboard they have created includes as a measure of social prosperity two factors. One is agency and the other one is solidarity. Now, agency really means that measures the empowerment of people and the possibility to influence their fate through their own actions. So it includes, for example, labor market insecurity, vulnerable employment, life expectancy, access to education, etc., which is an important measure, of course, for people, for their human well-being. The other one, solidarity, takes into account that we are social creatures and that we need some kind of sense of belonging to a social group in order for well-being to prosper among people. And now they measure it by, for example, by giving behavior or trust in others or social support. And now with this recoupling dashboard, we hope that we make an important contribution also towards progress with SDGs, because the social dimension is actually something that is difficult to measure and nevertheless very important to measure if we would really like to achieve broad-based and human-centered growth and prosperity by means of establishing the SDGs. Now, I think that we as think tanks have also an important role to play in making progress towards SDGs clearly. And as the Italian presidency is about to begin and India starts preparing their G20 presidency, also the dialogue with civil society, as you know, continues, including what's very dear to my heart and to the heart of the Global Solutions Initiative, the T20 process, the think tank process. And now SDG 17, in fact, claims that SDGs can only be realized with strong global partnerships. And I think that with the G20 and the dialogue with civil society, the T20, and also the other dialogue fora, the Women 20, the Business 20, the Civil 20, the world has in fact a very important instrument at hand to work on that development goal. And also with our Global Solutions Initiative, we are trying to support this goal. So for example, with the annual Global Solutions Summit in Berlin, that we typically organize together with the T20 process, we bring together researchers, decision makers from politics, from business, from international organizations, and from NGOs. And thereby we provide a forum there where we can build and reinforce these global partnerships and also enhance progress to SDGs globally by building coalitions there. Now, I think, and I would like to stress here in this group, that it can, and I hope it will be used also for the preparation of the Indian G20 presidency. And we would be very delighted to welcome a major Indian delegation at our summit next year in May 27th and 28th in Berlin, and thereby make our contribution from civil society, think tanks towards these and giving advice to G20 decision makers. Now, I think I'd like to end here, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Yeah, I ever attend one presentation, I think from Katarina, about recoupling dashboard, and then I think this will be good. I think this could be a solution, because now country can like separate, you know, the source of growth. I mean, the parameter for growth and parameter for climate change, parameter for social is different. So they sometimes like left one behind. So with this, this good. And then, but I have a question here. Actually, like you mentioned that G20 doesn't have mandate. Actually, they just like build a consensus and then try to make countries commit to something, right? So and if we make it kind of like standard and like encourage countries to implement that, do you think this can like for, I mean, recommendation, maybe suggestion for India or Italia or presidency, how to enforce that? I mean, with the way, I mean, doesn't have to be like from G20, but maybe they can find a way to enforce this kind of like goals or achievement or commitment for countries. Do you have a suggestion for that? Yeah.
So what we suggest in our policy brief is also, in order to raise somewhat accountability for SDG achievement, it should have a more prominent position in the reporting of the G20. So we suggest the G20 mutual assessment process, for example, as a place where really progress towards SDGs is.
Okay. Your voice freezing.
Where this is necessary, it has. Can you still hear me? Yeah. Yes. In some fields where this has helped to make progress, for example, in gender equality reporting, this has put some pressure on countries within the G20 to make progress. So this is something we suggest here. In general, I think what the G20 can do is really give broad support, provide top-level impetus, political impetus to major global agreements like climate agreements. What can also do importantly in this regard, I think, is it can well derive some norms. It can set norms for how countries work together. And I think this will particularly be important with regard to now rebuilding societies, rebuilding economies after the COVID crisis. And this has been stressed by basically all other speakers before it too, that the SDGs can provide an important guide, North Star for this recovery. And the G20, with its norm-setting power, can in fact, I think, have a major influence there on how economies and countries individually also have domestic policies geared towards sustainability and economic growth at the same time.
Okay, thank you. I think I get the sign from the host that we can like run out of time, and then thank you very much all the panelists, and then with that I can conclude this session, and then please join me not only for Dennis but for every panelist in this session, and then I will return the floor to Rajat. Thank you.
Thank you, Nella, for skillfully moderating this session. And thank you to all the speakers, Nick, Amar, Ajay, and Dennis, for providing a very rich content for the session. All of you will be glad to know that we will have the video and the PowerPoints on our website, so you can engage with this. And this is also for the participants, if they want to engage with the session more and to reflect what was said in the session, this will be available on our website. Thank you all very much. It's been a very rich and stimulating session. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajat. Thank you, Nella, Amar, Dennis. Pleasure being with you.
Thank you. Okay. If we go to the next session, we should leave here and use the...
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.